Hello, I'm Eric Holscher, and I'm one of the co-founders of Read the Docs. I've been a professional developer for over 10 years. And as a developer, I know that we value our time more than anything. Once it's gone, you can't get it back. And our time is being wasted. Our time is being wasted by bad documentation. Documentation is the instruction manual for software. Modern software is built out of hundreds of different pieces, each with their own set of instructions. When there's bad documentation, developers are left to fill in the gaps, wasting their time. Writing software without documentation is like assembling IKEA furniture without the instructions. Now imagine assembling that on a deadline. Developers don't have to imagine. That's their reality every day. They work on a deadline, and there's awful documentation everywhere in the software world. So a project that's supposed to take 1 week can easily take 2 or more. You have bad documentation, and you go down a path for like 3 days trying to figure out what happens, and that's wasted time. You just missed your deadline and spent 3 days, a whole week, just doing something who knows what, because someone pointed you in the wrong direction. But missing that deadline, that developer's time for that 1 week, was worth $8,000. But developers don't work alone. They work with other developers. They work with designers, UX people, managers. If there's a team of 10 working on that product, that wasted week costs $80,000 to their company. But time and money aren't the most important thing that gets lost. That team loses trust inside their organization when they miss their deadline. That company loses the trust of its customers when they miss their deadline. But this happens all the time, right? Like software is always late. Bad documentation is a huge part of why this happens. So why is documentation so bad, right? Like the process for creating documentation is broken. Let's talk about the old way of doing this. So first you write your code, right? This is the necessary step. But then you have to leave the comfort of your command line. You have to open your browser. You have to go to your documentation site, log in, search, figure out where the docs need to live, find the page. And you're like, all right, I'm going to start writing. This is great. Get words on paper. I'm doing my job. And you start fighting with your editor, right? Like, I hate WYSIWYG editors. You're like in there and you're like, oh, I gotta line up the style between these 2 pages so they look consistent, and trying to get a code block in there with proper highlighting. Has anyone tried to do that? You have to copy and paste it from another thing that code highlights it, and then it shows, and then you win the war of attrition. You win and you publish it and you're like, yes, I am being a good developer. I wrote my documentation. Then every time you change the code, you gotta do that shit all over again. You have to keep it up to date for every version of your software. That, my friends, is why documentation does not get written in most companies. So when we built Read the Docs, we thought, what is the right way to solve this problem? What's something that's so simple and easy that people will actually do it? Developers will even enjoy doing it, perhaps. I know it's blasphemy, but you write code, and then you write your documentation in the same editor. And then we do the rest. So that's what we've done with Read the Docs. So let's see how this works in practice. Your documentation and your code live together on GitHub, Bitbucket, or wherever else you host your docs and your code. Then you import that project into Read the Docs, and we pull down that repository, and we take markup that developers love to write and build it into an HTML version that everyone loves to read. And it's not just an HTML version. You can write that documentation and translate it in over 40 different languages. It's instantly searchable when you host it. You can download it as HTML, as PDFs, and as EPUBs for offline use. And it links right back to GitHub or Bitbucket for easy updates. And the biggest thing is that it gets updated and built every time your code or your documentation changes, automatically. It's just done for you. We've been doing this at readthedocs.org for over 4 years. This is an open source project that I co-founded 4 years ago to solve this problem. If you want, you can go and look at the code on GitHub. And it's been amazingly successful. Developers love this experience. In fact, people have localized Read the Docs into over 10 languages. So if you're in China and you go to readthedocs.org, the entire site shows up in Chinese. And then you can read documentation written in Chinese. And so this has resonated with developers all around the world. We have over 15,000 open source projects, and based on traffic, we're one of the largest open source websites in the world. We get over 11 million page views a month. And software really is a global industry. Users all over the world are using this. It's not just the United States. It's not just China, though it is our second biggest market. In the last 30 days, we've had users in every single country in the world. And those are users of the Django web framework. Those are users of Doctrine, one of the largest PHP ORMs. Those are users of the Chinese Redis translation of their documentation. There's just myriad projects that are doing all sorts of really amazing stuff with their documentation. These people aren't just users. We have a conference every year in the United States and in Europe that brings together the leading minds in documentation to talk about the problems in the software industry around documentation. We have people from Twitter, we have people from GitHub, we have people from Mozilla, we have Google, WordPress, even Puppet here in town is giving talks at our conference. We filled up the Crystal Ballroom down the street with people talking about software documentation. Like, that is this photo. Notice the amazing chandelier. It's a very cool venue. The floor is really creaky, though. It's weird. But it's not just users. Open source companies love us, too. Mozilla is one of the largest open source companies in the world. And multiple of their teams have standardized on Read the Docs as their documentation tool. But Read the Docs isn't just a tool. Read the Docs changes the way that you write documentation. It changes developers' behavior. When your documentation is always up to date and it lives next to your code, when you try to submit code to a repository and it doesn't have documentation, people call you on it. The code review is like, where are your docs, right? Like, this means the documentation for features always gets written. This means documentation is always up to date with the code. And this means that the documentation is more useful. So for Mozilla, documentation became a priority. And that is a fundamental shift in how developers create documentation. So that's what we've been doing at readthedocs.org for the past 4 years. We built this as an open source project because that's who we are. We're open source people, and we love it. And our mission was to create world-class tools for documentation. So developers have had world-class tools for programming for a long time. But the tools for documentation have been awful. It's been like a joke. And so Read the Docs, our mission was to elevate documentation in the software world to the same level as tests and as code. And that is what we've done with readthedocs.org. So we came to Pi. We were like, all right, we've done this for open source. It's amazing. But businesses are stuck in the dark ages. Like, they're still doing that shit that I talked about earlier. And so we're bringing Read the Docs to business. So that's what we've been doing for the past 3 months, is building readthedocs.com, which is for your private code for your business. We built on top of our existing open source solution, which has been battle tested for 4 years. And now we're bringing it to businesses, adding features that businesses are going to love. Biggest thing is we have to make it private, right? Like, all the open source documentation is open and on the internet. So the first thing we do is we lock down Read the Docs to securely host your company's documentation, so it only stays within your company. But some things don't need to stay within your whole company. They just need to stay within your team or between you and one other person. And we support those workflows as well. You have to understand how your documentation is being used in order to write it well. We let you know which pages are being read and who's reading them. So when you actually spend your precious time writing documentation, you're writing it on pages that people read. You're not just throwing your words away, writing stuff that never gets read. And the same workflow that worked for Mozilla is going to work for every company. Requiring documentation before code goes live is the only way to make sure the documentation is always up to date. And Read the Docs enables that by having the documentation and the code live together. And so we're ready today. One more. Read the Docs. Also keeps all your documentation in one place. If you've worked at a software company, it's like, was that document in like Dropbox? Was it on GitHub? Did somebody write it in the wiki? Which one of our wikis? Like, Read the Docs is the one search bar that you have to search for to find your software documentation. And this vastly simplifies people actually reading the documentation once it's written. And so we're ready to help companies create amazing documentation. Because we've been doing this for over 5 years each. Our team has over 10 years of experience creating documentation tools. And we're open source developers, but we've also had day jobs. We've worked at software companies. We understand this problem. So documentation is now a solved problem for your business. You can host your open source documentation on readthedocs.org, just like you always have. Nothing there changes. But now your private documentation can live on readthedocs.com. And even, we went out of our way today in the last minute, in our precious time, to document demo day for you. So if you want to figure out, if you want to use Read the Docs, you can go to docs.pypdx.org. We've actually documented all the companies that you've seen today, all of the special offers they're giving you, and you can even learn a little bit more about each of the companies. This also looks amazingly good on a mobile phone, since that's the theme today, is take out your phone. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And so today we're announcing our private beta at readthedocs.com. You can go and sign up, put your email in, and we're going to let people in slowly so that we can make sure we control the quality as people come on. But we're going to try and get all the people that are here at Demo Day in first. So go and sign up as soon as you can if this is something that your company could use. So I would like to invite everyone, whether you're an open source developer, whether you work at a company, or whether you're both, to join us in improving software documentation in the entire software industry. Thank you.